Hello, I'm HG Tudor, and welcome to another Tea with Sam and HG. The delectable Sam is there with her appropriate brew, there we are, and a glorious sunny day where she is, and it's also a glorious sunny day where I am. But of course, as ever, mysterious man that I am, you can't see that. Today, we're going to be discussing our empathy and its traits being lost. And obviously, you're going to have the perspective from me, a narcissistic psychopath, and from Sam, an empath. So, hello, Sam. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks, HG. How are you?
I'm tiggity-boo. Thank you for your kind inquiry. So, what is it that you're drinking there? What's the tea today?
Well, I thought I'd mix it up a little bit. I've normally just a straight builder's tea kind of girl, but today I'm having some vanilla chai.
Vanilla chai?
Yeah, vanilla chai. Got a bit of cinnamon in it. It's actually very, very nice.
Okay, so are you going to start singing "Chai Chai Baby" as a consequence of that?
Hopefully.
Well, you have the advantage over me. I've just gone for a straightforward Yorkshire tea today here at Tudor Towers, so that's halfway drunk already. Actually, a little bit of thirst on me as I've been pulling together some more videos for the valuable viewers to enjoy. Okay, so empathy. Well, we're all familiar with what empathy is, and I've spoken about the various strands of emotional empathy that exist. I have cognitive empathy, you have emotional empathy.
Yeah.
So your empathy comes from a position of feeling, and that your emotional empathy is a combination of both having a genetic component to it, so you had a genetic aspect to it, and also the way that you've been brought up as well. There's an environmental aspect, and those two things come together in the creation of your emotional empathy. I am devoid of emotional empathy because I don't have the genetic component, because as a narcissistic psychopath, it was absent in me. However, as a consequence of many of my videos that I've explained the way that I look at the world, I'm able to form cognitive empathy, to understand the way that it's appropriate in certain situations to behave, even if I might wrinkle my nose at it. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of emotional empathy, as we know, everybody has it apart from my grouping, the narcissist. So, empaths such as yourself, you have considerable emotional empathy for a wide range of people. The normals also have deep emotional empathy, but for a shorter bandwidth of individuals, a smaller grouping. Narcissistic people even have a touch of emotional empathy, although it's limited in its application. I don't have any, and some of my kind don't even have cognitive empathy. So you're governed by your emotional empathy in your day-to-day activities and actions and decision-making, almost like an invisible force that's there. Other times you will actually think about your behavior, but a lot of the time it's just instinctive.
Yeah.
And thus the world revolves with many people exhibiting this emotional empathy. But it's now the case that many people comment upon the fact that they seem to think that empathy is being eroded, that they perhaps attribute that to people being less patient and exhibiting less manners. Is that something you recognize?
Yes, I think it is. I think there is definitely, especially within the Western society that we live in, there appears to be more of a swing towards, not in all cases, but, like there is more sort of, I guess, selfish components to how we live our lives. We think more about our own needs at the expense of other people's sometimes. I'm not talking about myself specifically, but it definitely feels like that the society is definitely becoming more narcissistic. But whether that's eroding empathy, I'm not 100% sure. Because I feel like empathy is such an innate part of being a human being for most of us, not for everybody, obviously, that in some ways empathy is perhaps being lost in some ways, but is evolving in other ways. That makes any sort of sense.
How do you see it evolving in other ways?
Well, for instance, for me, there are. I know that you have your very extensive framework of empathy, how it works and how it manifests in different ways. I think there are some elements of empathy which are a blessing, and some elements of empathy which are perhaps a bit of a curse, and that can go into trouble. And so I think what's happening as society is becoming more narcissistic in some ways. It's forcing elements of empathy to become some of the empathy is being hijacked and corrupted and taken in directions like you talk about, the sort of the wokeism, and how the trait of caring, which is an empathic trait, is being corrupted and is being twisted into something else, which actually is very far from caring. There's that element of it, but then there's also that element of, if you are someone who has experienced narcissistic abuse like myself, that forced me to look at my own relationship with my own empathy and analyze it, and perhaps deal with certain aspects of myself that made me vulnerable to abuse and manipulation. And they, I would say, have forced my empathy to evolve in some ways and become a more, for want of a better word, empowered form of empathy. So the empathy, I believe empathy is kind of evolving, and I don't know what you think about that idea.
Okay, I think it both agree that there does levels of empathy are becoming reduced.
Yeah.
And I think that they would be two factors that would support why that is. The first is, if we look at the population of the world and we break it down into those four groupings that I do, so narcissists, narcissistic individuals, empaths and normals. The latter three groupings are the ones with emotional empathy.
Yeah.
It follows, as a matter of logic, that if there are more narcissists populating the earth, as I've explained in previous videos, that is the case, and that we don't have any emotional empathy, it follows that the sort of world's bank of emotional empathy is going to reduce because there are more people appearing on the planet who don't have it.
Yeah.
So that's point one.
Yeah.
But then I think the bigger point, because although the number of narcissists is increasing both in terms of the population of the world as a whole, but also as a proportion of people on the planet, I think the major aspect of the diminution and reduction of empathy is that those who have it have less of it than they once did, and that they wield it less often. And I think that's what is the main cause behind the reduction in emotional empathy, that not so much that those of us who don't have it are becoming more numerous, although that is a influencing factor, but it's more the fact that those that have got it in a way aren't using it as often as they once did. It's a little bit like, in a way, that certain parts of the world, women don't have children as much as they once did, and therefore the birth rate has dropped. They have the capacity to have children, but they don't, and therefore the birth rate has dropped. So all of these people have the capacity for emotional empathy, but they're not exercising it as often. They're not losing it. It's not being taken away, but I think it's very much being reduced. And it's interesting because a few years ago, there was a survey which was undertaken, Sam, amongst young people. So it's specified, I think, in the sort of 18 to 25 age group. And that survey concluded that those individuals felt that they had reduced emotional empathy for people. So, and it was a statistically significant group that was tested. And of course, there's always going to be a degree of subjectiveness with regard to how they regard themselves as having levels of emotional empathy. But overall, the finding was that they had reduced emotional empathy. So then the next question becomes, why? And it's interesting because the study concluded that the answer was because of the pressures that they face.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's not that there was a sudden shift, the drinking water has caused the genetic component to alter so that they've got reduced levels, but rather an environmental factor, which was suggesting that the pressures that young people find themselves under in terms of succeeding academically, getting a job, getting a well-paid job, getting on the housing ladder, etc., has contributed to an increase in effect of the narcissistic trait of being more selfish. And thus their emotional empathy for others has been reduced. Now, I found this rather interesting because as a proposition, it does make sense. If you feel that the world is a more difficult place for you to navigate your way through, as a matter of survival, it would suggest that rather than thinking about other people, you've got to look after yourself. So let's take, for example, it's the apocalypse, okay? And there's been a nuclear strike upon the United Kingdom, which means that the threads that keep everybody together are no longer there. They've been torn apart, and because of the greater reliance that people have, that they become de-skilled, people wouldn't know how to grow vegetables, all of that type of thing. We rely on so many other people to provide all of these needs.
Yes.
All of a sudden you have people who once upon a time, in your neighborhood, you might look out for your neighbors, can I borrow a cup of sugar kind of thing, and you check on them, they're all right. All of a sudden you're all fighting over reduced resources. And so that external stressor, albeit a dramatic one, would undoubtedly cause you to, I don't care so much about my neighbors anymore because I've got to look after myself and my 2 children and my spouse. So it makes sense as a proposition that if you're competing for diminished resources, i.e. less jobs, fewer that are well paid, it's more difficult to get on the housing ladder, that would make sense. But then it caused me to think about this. Why haven't we seen that reduction in emotional empathy for those who endured World War II? Why didn't we see it in the immediate aftermath when there was rationing? Or maybe it was there, but nobody recorded it. But generally speaking, people talk about the Blitz spirit, etc., the way that people pulled together, pack up your old troubles and, kit bag, etc. And people just got on with it. So, and then take, for example, Generation X, often called the forgotten generation of, the latchkey kids, who walk home from school on your own. Mum and dad would be out at work, let yourself in, make yourself a Hartley's jam sandwich and plonk yourself down in front of the television, drink out of the hose in the garden, climb up a tree, fall out of it, break your leg, don't come running to me, etc., etc. That generation there doesn't report on any reduced emotional empathy, yet they face their own pressures also. So I think it's very interesting that we can look at different generations at different times in history and say, okay, this study is valid. It shows that it was reduced as a consequence of pressure. But these other people have experienced pressure and we don't seem to have seen a reduction in emotional empathy there. So any thoughts on that?
Well, I do have a thought. I don't know how much it relates to empathy necessarily, but I came across a concept recently, which was about how things kind of go in seasons. I think I heard a Tony Robbins thing, and he's an interesting chap that I'm sure you could do a great roasting of. But,
Tony Robbins.
But Tony Robbins was talking about this book that he read called Generations and Seasons, and he was saying things go through cycles. So you have winter, spring, summer, autumn, and that as a society at the moment, we are coming into a winter, and winters create bad times. Everything's scarce, resources are limited, etc. And bad times create strong people. Strong people create good times. Good times create weak people create bad times. And it goes around in a circle like that. So that might sort of have some bearing on empathy and how people kind of pull together within communities, because in the good times, people do become more selfish. They don't need to pull together in that sort of a way. And I think that at the moment, even though it seems like society is in some ways becoming, you talk about the apocalypse, there are a lot of people that feel like we're heading into some kind of apocalyptic sort of scenario at the moment. And even though you don't hear about it so much, I'm very much aware of communities coming together and reforming exactly what it is that you were just talking about, as in, how do we sort of create local food growing communities? How do we survive if we can't rely on the system to provide us with these basic needs that we've kind of almost been trained into being dependent upon? So I think that it is there. It's just kind of, we don't hear about it so much because those elements and those qualities they're not reaching the mainstream sort of media, but also, again, they're not always they're not recognized as being, the society values more narcissistic traits than the empathic traits, if you see what I mean, or the being.
What it appears that you're suggesting is that when, as I've identified, that when there are these pressures placed upon people,
yes,
that we see that those individuals have become more selfish.
Yes.
But you're identifying instances where people pull together and actually it goes in the opposite direction.
Yes.
Now, this survey focused on a particular demographic, as I say, 18-year-olds to 25-year-olds. Their response, this was done, I think, about 10 years ago.
Okay.
So I guess we're looking at millennials. And that group's response to pressure was to become more selfish. Now, it'd be interesting. What if you looked at people sort of 40 and above? Is their response to pressure to actually think, how can we solve this? How can we help other people? So it's not just linked to a wholesale, the seasons that you've mentioned, although there is a logic to that. I follow what you're saying, but that there are different sections within society that respond differently to it. And again, is it only certain groups that are experiencing the reduction in emotional empathy, like those young people? And then is it the case that those with the emotional empathy who are older will shuffle off this mortal coil? And then that means that they're replaced by people who have had diminished emotional empathy, and it stays diminished, or might it grow back? But it's interesting to note that the suggestion was that it was pressure that caused it.
Yeah.
But as I've identified, there's lots of points in history where pressure has arisen, and there doesn't appear to have then been a correlated diminishing of emotional empathy. So is it the case that because I wouldn't suggest that the pressure that group faces is any greater than the fact that your house has just had a bomb fall on it?
I know. Well, in fact, in some ways, it seems like it would be less.
Exactly. So you would think to yourself, it would be those in World War II that would be with less resources, facing a greater threat of death and dismemberment, etc., that they would have less emotional empathy, but that doesn't appear to have been the case. So perhaps there has been some run on in the biological side of things, that the genetic aspect is that those who've been created within this grouping of this age group are such that their foundation of emotional empathy, their sort of proto-empathy, is less to begin with. And so that they are actually more susceptible to that environmental factor of pressure. So that older people, their proto-empathy, they had greater resilience. So when the pressure came along, it resisted it and it didn't diminish. But something has happened in the way that, and I know we're talking in broad brush terms, but it's just an idea that when we get to people who are in that age group, their initial empathy doesn't have the same level of resilience. So it's easier to push it down when pressure, and admittedly, pressure which is not the same as that which was experienced by those who lived through World War II and the aftermath. Because I think objectively you would look at it and say, who had it harder? Someone who risked the house being bombed and being sent off to the front line and rationing, or someone who's told, I'm sorry, you're not suitable for this position, flipping burgers at McDonald's. Boo-hoo, I need a safe space. So,
but I guess it's that thing of like, some have the idea, and I think this as well, like adversity creates like some of for me some of the most empathic and compassionate and wise people are people who have experienced horrific adversity, but have managed to kind of, as I say, that their empathy around it has perhaps evolved into a more, I don't want to use the word mature, but just a kind of a more whole empathy, which isn't based on, because for me, there's different elements of empathy. Like there is that empathy, where you're just really sensitive to the needs of other people, but you're so caught up in that other person's feelings and experience that you kind of almost suffer and drown with them. But then there's that other type of empathy where you can recognize somebody's other feelings and you're compassionate towards them, but you don't have to get sucked into playing out their story with them. So there's like different strands within it which will have different outcomes. And so if the empathy is more of the latter kind, from that place there is more possibility for actual genuine help to be offered and given, which is empowered rather than just suffering with somebody, if that makes any sort of sense.
I see. Another thought that I had about this, and we both have agreement that emotional empathy is being reduced. And as I mentioned, so we have that proposition that a section of society has reduced emotional empathy as a consequence of an external stressor, that they feel that pressure and they're not resilient as generations before them. But I also considered it's well known that people start to have empathy fatigue or compassion fatigue as a consequence of repeated exposure
Yeah.
to disaster or trauma or illness. So this would cover doctors and nurses and veterinarians and clergy and teachers and police and firefighters and paramedics and animal welfare workers and social workers and volunteers. And therefore, and that covers a lot of people, and there are probably several that I've missed off there. So those people who have been exposed to disaster, trauma and illness, and of course we just recently had a pandemic, might it be then that there's a reduction in emotional empathy because there's more disaster in the world?
But is there more disaster in the world? I mean, we've just been talking about, the First and Second World War. That there was equally as much disaster then, but I totally get what you're saying. My sister's a social worker, and some of the situations that she deals with are just horrific. But she said over time, you just get you can't take it all on. You just can't allow yourself to identify, and obviously you can have the compassion, but again, it's that thing of going, where's the empathy? For me, it's about what type of empathy is it? Is it the type where you're getting kind of drawn into another person's life and experience, or where you can remain and have distance between? But I mean, it is that definite. It's the same thing when you experience abuse or, the external stresses, because I, as an empath, can recognize I have less tolerance now for stuff which in the past, as an empath, I would have got much more drawn into and felt responsible for. And the erosion of my emotional empathy through repeated experiences of being exposed to narcissists has really toughened me up, actually, and made me that more resilient, sort of bounce back a lot quicker sort of person than when I first used to come across it, and I used to get very much kind of affected by it in a much deeper way.
Yeah. Okay. And you made the point there about, is there more disaster in the world? And of course, we had a pandemic. There's a war taking place in Ukraine. There are various conflicts dotted around the world. Taiwan, it's tense there. There's a situation with rebels having emerged again in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You have, for example, even in Britain, which is a rich country, 14 million people, which is what? Just over 20% of the population or thereabouts, is in poverty.
Yeah.
And, there are children who are going to school that don't have breakfast and so forth. And consequently, is that putting a strain both on terms of the people that have to deal with all of that, because you're just getting waves and waves and waves of people who are in difficulties. And of course, there's a difference between becoming desensitized to something because you're desensitized because that's the way of coping to get through the job. So if you're a paramedic, you can't go, oh, blood, and run away. You have to sort of, you must deal with that, but you can still do so with empathy. Whereas the fatigue of this compassion and empathy, which is recognized, and I thought, well, is it because there's more disaster in the world? And it's difficult to gauge that. And then my mind moved on to something else, which was this, that comparatively, the world actually is probably a better place than it once was. But many people will not feel that that's the case. For instance, most Western nations are less violent than they used to be. You go back to the Victorian age, you'd stand a good chance of getting mugged in a pea souper. Violence, gin was the ruin of the working classes, etc. All of those things. But it was more, society was more violent, less caring than it was. It didn't have the support networks in place. Off you went to the poorhouse, people died of disease in the streets and so on and so forth. It was, I think most people would agree, it was a harder society.
Yeah.
Have all of the, there of course are many problems that still exist around the world. But is there more disaster as a whole in the world? Difficult to evaluate, but I think what it comes down to is this. There's a greater level of exposure to it.
Yes.
Because once upon a time, if it might take a few days before you might have actually heard about a cholera outbreak, say in Newcastle, if you lived in London, because news would have to travel, and that news would travel either on somebody on a horse or later on somebody on a train. There wasn't a news channel, and there certainly wasn't the internet. And you wouldn't know about some disaster that had befallen people on the other side of the world, possibly for weeks or months later. And it certainly didn't appear in your living room in pin-sharp crikey vision. So I think what it is whilst it's probably fairly difficult to evaluate, is there more disaster in the world than there used to be? I think that there is almost this unrelenting diet of misery that is pumped out in terms of actual reportage of events, because now news agencies can get to these places very quickly. They can film it and broadcast it, and you can receive it in your pocket. You don't even need to be near a television set anymore. You can get it in your pocket. Two, many people utilize disaster for political leverage.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they churn it out again and again and again. It reminds me a little bit of the film V for Vendetta, where there's a stage at the film where they're in the pub and it's showing repeated broadcasts about another outbreak of disease, that a terrorist bomb has gone off, and one of the patrons in the pub goes, "Can you believe this bullshit? It's been going on all summer." And it's propaganda that's being used by the state in order to keep people under control. But again, there are those that continue to basically say, you know, we're one step away from absolute apocalyptic doom. So, you know, ready yourself. Yeah. Then there's also the fact that people will utilize that for the purposes of wanting to do genuine good. You compare, for example, how many charity advertisements you would see 30 years ago to how many you see now. You know, if you have the misfortune to be watching daytime television, undoubtedly 2 or 3 of the advertisements will be showing you some child in some poor predicament, a donkey that's struggling under the weight of bricks that are being carried elsewhere, and so on and so forth. And then go into your social media feed, and there's another advertisement with somebody wanting money and somebody talking about this disaster in another part of the world. And I suspect that that is what's driving fatigue and emotional empathy, is that people are just punch drunk from being shown disaster and misery. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's like, I lived in London for many, many years, and the amount of homeless people that you would see on the streets. And when I first moved there, I used to want to help every single one of them, and I'd give a little bit of something, or at least go and talk to them. But as time goes on and you're exposed to more and more of it, there comes a point where you're like, I literally can't keep this up. I can't keep it up, and you stop looking. Because it's too painful if you are an empath, I guess, to kind of keep absorbing this information and not being really affected by it. So I can totally understand that has created a fatigue. But whether it's actually stopped, whether it's actually kind of diminishing in it in a way which is going to kind of create some future where empathy doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, that's quite a frightening prospect for me anyway.
Well, I'm pleased you said that, because you've actually anticipated the next point I was going to lead on to, which is to query, perhaps it's a shift in the evolution of human beings.
Well, I know, and this is terrifying. But what I would hope, and which is what I was alluding to earlier, is that, because for me, everything, it needs to stay in balance. And so perhaps if we are shifting into this more maybe narcissistic society, that the empathic side will have to almost fight back in some way, and evolve itself, so that it can kind of meet it in a way which means it doesn't overtake. Maybe that's a fantasy of mine, but that's what I like to think. But I absolutely agree with you that there is a shift coming. There is totally a shift.
Yeah, and it caused me to think that, is this just sort of an evolutionary thing that's necessary for the survival of Homo sapiens, that society has to become more selfish in order for it to survive? Because some would say, well, if society becomes more selfish, that's what's going to cause its demise. But there's a reduction of resources, and therefore, as a consequence of that, there are more and more people, and in particular parts of the world, scrambling to lay their hands upon particular resources and assets, when there are more of them and fewer of these assets and resources. Now, of course, there'll be some people who immediately say, but you see, that's propaganda, HG. People are just saying that's the case in order to protect their position, and that might be right. But let us assume that that's correct. So water shortages, crop failures, reduction of natural resources, running out of the things that are all being made in factories in China, the climate activism that's been taking place, and the allegations that, you know, that there's a climate emergency taking place, which will perhaps then impact upon rising sea levels, meaning less land to live on, or less habitable land, and then the impact upon crops. You know, talking about the bees disappearing, and therefore there'll be less pollination of crops, etc., leading to food shortages. And again, I recognise there'll be people who are saying, "Oh, this is, you know, this is the WF and their agenda, and they want people to be frightened into all of it." Well, let's just put that to one side. You may be right about that, but let us assume that you have these reduced resources and more people as the population's planet hits 8 billion. The population of the planet hits 8 billion. That is it the case that human beings are having to evolve to become more selfish, so that we will lose a number of people? They will starve, they will succumb to disease, because those are the major curbers of population compared to armed conflict. But that's necessary for it to happen, and it comes back to the survival of the fittest, that we have to evolve in terms of becoming more selfish in order to get through what's ahead. Or is it the case that selfishness driven by something else is actually going to prove the undoing of the human race?
Well, it could go either way, couldn't it? From my perspective, I feel like it could go either way. And I think it's definitely about some sort of evolutionary thing that's happening. And is it survival of the fittest, or is it survival of the most adaptable? Is it survival of those that can adapt to the circumstances that are coming? And you know, I feel like the reason we are getting into all these difficulties as humanity is because of the more narcissistic elements taking over, and sort of a small minority of people taking the resources away from the rest of everybody else. And so it is forcing people to evolve and to think outside the box. But what is it they say? Necessity is the mother of all creation and invention. It's going to force, it's going to force people to find different ways to exist and coexist. And it's for me, it's about the survival of the most adaptable. So yes, all these things are happening, and it is going to have huge impacts on society. But what it's going to evolve is, I guess, not just human beings, but consciousness. You know, like, how do we relate with the world around us, and how can we use the situation that we're in to survive ultimately? Now,
I'm going to sort of slightly put you on the spot here.
Oh no.
Naturally, I don't give a rat's ass about the reduction in emotional empathy for two reasons. One, there's still going to be enough empathic people for me to feed on. And two, should it reach some kind of crisis point, well, I'll be dead anyway, so what will I care? Because it's not going to happen overnight. This downward trend of emotional empathy, assuming it's not checked, it's not going to affect me, because I'll be gone. So there we are. Okay, my legacy will live on, but I'll be gone. But you as an empathic person, first of all, to what extent does it trouble you recognizing this reduction in emotional empathy?
Well, I guess it doesn't trouble me huge amounts, because I think even though I can recognize there is a reduction in certain types of empathy, I think like there is an evolution of empathy in a different way, which is actually going to become a more empowered form of empathy. So I don't, it doesn't trouble me in that sort of a sense. I feel like I'm very worried about the state of the world that we live in and what's happening within it, from many different aspects. And I kind of fear for my children's generation, for my children, and what they're going to have to deal with. But I also, I guess this is part of my empathic kind of faith sort of about, you know, human beings in general, is that we, you know, the empaths will get through it, that humanity will get through it in a way which ultimately serves the greater good. And so I can look at it in that way, and so I don't get despondent, and I don't go into the despair and the worry about it, because again, that's not helping or serving anybody. I can recognize the issues, but I choose now to focus on solutions, which is how I kind of dealt with narcissistic abuse. Again, it's all part, for me, it's all part of the same lesson. It's like, while we focus on the issues and the problem and the other person and the situations, whilst we have to acknowledge that, the only thing that we can ever really have any control and power over is ourselves, and creating and putting the energy into what we do want our society to be and how we do want things to be. And I think there's enough people doing that, maybe very much under the radar, that I have faith that humanity will come through this in a way which will actually be an amazing advancement for human beings. And so everything that's going on, while it's creating all these problems, is actually just forcing everything to evolve in a really, ultimately, it's not neither good nor bad. It's just going to evolve in a way which I think will serve humanity in the long run. So I don't personally worry about it in that way, but I do recognize that for there is going to be a lot of suffering, and my children and their generation are going to have to really, gosh, they're going to have to really dig deep and find all kinds. It's going to be quite horrendous for them, I think. Yeah.
So you're the eternal optimist, essentially.
Rather annoyingly, probably, yes. So
I wouldn't necessarily say that's annoying. Optimism, if it's founded on evidence, is a sensible trait, isn't it? So,
well, I'd like to
and you may well be right that there may well be a case that humanity evolves its way out of this current reduction in emotional empathy.
I can be accused of being a little bit Pollyanna about things. I'll always try and find the positive in a situation, or the nugget of gold that I can grasp within something, rather than focusing on all the bad shit. Because again, like, it just, for me, it doesn't sort of bring anything for me that's useful. I'd rather find solutions within something, and I think there is lots of people that do view it like that.
Well, certainly, I always, as you know, tell people to focus on the evidence and action and what can be done about a situation.
Yeah.
And recognizing if you can't, then move on to something else. So I certainly applaud the approach of looking to the logic and doing something rather than worrying about the things that you can't do anything about.
Yeah.
And
but
so
to be more the other. And that's what I'm saying. The narcissistic abuse, the adversity of that experience has brought that realization and that logic to me. And if I hadn't had those experiences, I wouldn't realize that. So maybe humanity needs all this narcissistic shit that's going on to wake it up, to recognize that it needs to kind of really look at the way that we live as a society and go, all the things that we're attaching the value to, they're not actually the things that we should be. That we're looking for all our happiness and our stuff from the outside in, rather than actually seeing what we can do to as human beings to create our own lives without having to depend on things on the outside. So I don't know if this is to do with empathy or not, but.
And in terms of looking at ways, for instance, that you would consider as effective to halt this decline, part of it is, as you've alluded to, you feel that there's going to be an evolved response to it. Almost, nature will take care of itself. But do you think there's anything that human beings specifically ought to be doing? Rather than doing #BeKind and nonsense such as that, which invariably gets hijacked by my kind anyway. Do you think there are steps that people could be taking that would start to arrest this decline in emotional empathy?
I do, yeah. I think it's to do with what we were just talking about, self responsibility, to stop needing things on the outside to provide our own sources of security, or just taking more control over what you are, how you are living your life, thinking about, right, let me think about this. What can people do? For me, everything is what I learned through my experiences of narcissistic abuse. And I think what's happening in society at the moment is kind of like a big narcissistic abuse on human beings. It's about taking your power back, about taking self-responsibility, stop focusing on what's going on outside of you, and take more responsibility for what you are producing and what you are giving and how you are living your life. So for instance, I've moved to a place where I can start to grow my own food, for instance, and think about how I can how I can sort of form better connections within the community that I live in, and how I can create energy from solar power. I mean, I'm sort of perhaps not going into it properly, but it's about self-responsibility at the end of the day, and also about educating yourself and questioning things. If we educate ourselves around narcissism, for example, and all the information that I've learned from your channel and how I've reframed that and looked at the whole society that we live in, and can recognize now that actually a lot of the things that exist within our world outside of us are running off actually narcissistic manipulations of us as human beings. Now, once I start to recognize that and educate myself about what's going on in the world and in a more kind of real way, as opposed to through a disillusioned lens, then I can start to take that power back and recognize where things are being used outside of me, like the television and media, to control me and put me in a fear state. So once I remove those aspects from my life consciously, because I can recognize actually this is harming me, this is corrupting my empathic trait of justice or my empathic traits of caring in a way which is actually not serving me, it's making me vulnerable to these manipulations and fear, then I can start to take more responsibility for my own life and what I allow in it, and how I show up for myself and for the world as a whole. So I think there is things that we can do, and a lot of it is from education, learning about narcissism, and then also taking the self-responsibility and also to look at those parts of me that hand that power over in the first place. And that's about healing yourself and investigating your beliefs that you have about the world and going, is that true or is that not? Actually, I've got to learn to question everything. And so those things stop my emotional empathy, I feel, becoming eroded, but actually make it a more resilient form of empathy rather than one which causes me to suffer and drown with all the pain and suffering that's going on.
Okay, so as part of that, would you think, for instance, removing yourself from certain types of information that's provided, would you see that as useful? For example, I mentioned about how social media is something where it has caused this overexposure to people, that has caused a lot of people to suddenly see so much tragedy and disaster and misery. What about pulling the plug on it or switching it off? Is that something that you'd advocate, or either on an individual level, or would you see that there should be greater regulation of that in terms of ensuring that that type of information isn't put out there? Or should it be the case that people should be free to decide what they want to look at, and they should be allowed to make an adult decision as to, is this something that they should be exposed to anyway, because the world is a harsh and venal place?
Exactly. It's like where your attention goes, energy flows. I don't watch any news at all. And maybe I'm quite ignorant about what's going, because for me, I feel like it's a lot of the mainstream media, and not even just the mainstream media, the alternative media are just things which keep me in a fear vibration. They keep me in a place where I'm worrying about things that I have literally no control over whatsoever. And so whilst I think it's good to be aware of what's going on in a very general way, I don't want to have that information being streamed at me 24/7. And I know some people get hooked into the news because it's adrenaline, it kicks, it's creating chemical reactions in our bodies, and it's actually an addiction on some level, because we feed off the drama and the excitement, and we're not even aware of it. So I actually don't watch any news at all. And at one point I got quite interested in like the alternative, I guess the more conspiracy side of things as well, and I started looking at that, and then I was like, that's just exactly the same. It's exactly the same. It's all fear-based, fear-mongering, which is just keeping me in a place where I'm just not happy, and I'm not living my life. So what can I do? I can stop those elements, a bit like going no contact. I don't have to engage in that, because I can see it's harming me. It's not making me happy. It's actually keeping me sad. And I know some people will say that's a apathetic point. It's not. I'm fully aware of what's going on. Well, not fully aware. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff that's going on that I'm not aware of. But it's about a choice, isn't it? It's about going, that doesn't make me feel good. And when we're not feeling good, we're no good to anybody, are we? So if we want to be compassionate and we want to have those empathic qualities of caring for people, then we need to look after our own energetic states and what we allow in and out of our awareness. I mean,
so accordingly, as a proposition,
stuff. So I do look at a lot of narcissism stuff, and some people would say, well, that puts you in a fear vibration, but actually it doesn't. I don't find that at all. I just find it really fascinating and interesting, and that's the kind of information that I want to absorb, because from there I can recognize things much more clearly.
So in effect, would it be correct to say that your position is, where I recognize that it causes me fear, or the fear vibration, as you've alluded to, I'll retreat from that and not expose myself to it any longer, because I recognize it's not good for me?
Especially when I think a lot of it isn't even necessarily, it's a distorted version of the truth.
Sure.
So I'm just like, well, why look at that? It's like, I don't watch horror films and things like that. I know a lot of people love horror films because they get, but it's because it's creating a chemical reaction in your body. That's just a choice for myself.
Sure, I understand that, and of course, there's a difference between choosing to watch a horror film and watching the real life horror of the world that we live in.
Yeah.
However, so that's a form of self-preservation, which is eminently sensible for you because you recognise I can't deal with this diet of tragedy and disaster and misery. So I'm whether it's actual or whether it's manufactured or whether it's or the fact that it's regurgitated repeatedly, that makes me feel frightened. I don't like feeling frightened, so I'm not, and I can't do anything about it, so I'm not going to watch it any longer. Yeah. So that's sensible, but then that's quite a selfish act, isn't it?
Is it?
Well, you're choosing to ignore what's going on in the world.
But I can't do anything about it anyway.
Well, you might not be able to as an individual, but if lots of people all start to decide, and I'm playing devil's advocate with you now, if you all start to decide, well, we're not going, I'm just going to shut myself off to all of these ills because I, individual, can't do anything about it, then the collective starts to crumble, doesn't it?
Well, maybe, but it depends on what you do with the information. It's like, do I focus on it and try and, it's like, do I try and fix and change a narcissist? Do I stay here and try and fix and heal all that stuff over there, which I ultimately have recognized now I can't? Or do I put my focus and energy on finding a solution to that? So it's not like I'm just ignoring it and pretending it's not happening. It's going, I can see that that's happening over there, but I know the solution is not to fight it or engage with it or get wrapped up and start rolling around with it because it's narcissistic in its foundation, and therefore all I'm doing is by feeding it, I'm just feeding it. I'm feeding it my energy and my attention, which is what it needs to keep going. So if everyone stopped giving their energy and attention to it, perhaps it would just burn itself out because there would be nothing to fuel it anymore. And what I'd rather do is so I don't think it is a selfish act to do that. I think it's actually a selfless act to do it because the old me would have felt responsible for that. And the empathy within me would have wanted to fix and heal it and make it okay. But really, it's actually painful for me to kind of know that stuff's going on and not directly address it. But I've realized through my journey of narcissistic abuse that it's way more productive for me to stop feeding my energy to that and try and fix and heal and change it and find a better solution, which is about creating a parallel or an alternative solution to that.
Okay. Now, given that we both accept that there is a reduction in emotional empathy in the world, and that we've identified that potential causes of that are certain pressures on certain demographic groups who are perhaps not as resilient to deal with it.
Yeah.
The fact that there are certain people that are repeatedly exposed to disaster in the world, of which there might be more, and we certainly both agree that there's certainly a greater exposure to it as a consequence of the way that news is delivered and the presence of social media, that much of the impact on emotional empathy is coming from a place of, to put it in blunt terms, the bad things in the world.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we then ask, what's causing these bad things? Who's causing the famines and the wars and the economic pillaging and the increased house prices and the cost of living crisis and all of those things? It's not solely the preserve of, but as you know from my work, you'd be able to trace it back to the actions of my kind, because there is no emotional empathy. It's about that control. It's about the hoarding of resources. It's about the lack of boundary recognition by invading another sovereign state, all of these factors. So it's the narcissists and the psychopaths, not wholly, but largely, that are behind, because of our differing mindset, many of the ills of the world. And I think most people would agree with that. And therefore, the ills of the world, like this tsunami of misery, is then becoming so great that people can't deal with it in the way that they once perhaps did. Yeah. So it's reducing their emotional empathy. So is it not then the solution to tackle the ultimate cause, which is my lot?
Yeah, but as I think the way that we tackle it, from my own perspective and from what I've learned through your work, is about no contact.
Yeah.
And so how do we as human beings go no contact with the rest of society?
Well, indeed, and therein lies the conundrum.
It is the conundrum, but that's what I'm trying to do with my life. And that's what I'm talking about, taking the control, trying to take some control of how I use resources into my own hands as much as possible. I mean, you can never divorce yourself from it all, because we're all kind of living right in it. It's like it's like a huge entangled web of which we are. But the more we struggle and resist and fight it, the more wrapped up in it we get. And that's one of the big lessons of narcissistic abuse for me, was like, the more I fight and resist and struggle against it, the more I'm feeding it. So
I mean, history has shown that, again, it's largely my kind that have held our hands on the reins of power and decision making all through history, in terms of wars and religious persecution. So nothing has altered in thousands of years. So it doesn't suggest that that's going to change anytime soon.
Actually, and this is a question. It's like, it feels like in the last sort of maybe 10 or 15, 20 years, the veil is being lifted about the narcissism, the psychopathy that exists. Of course, it's always been there. So actually, has anything really changed? This stuff has been going on for thousands, not hundreds of thousands of years. You can go right back to the pharaohs. And it's about, so I came across a theory recently. I was at a talk by a guy called Bruce Parry. Have you ever heard of Bruce Parry?
No.
He used to do a TV series on the BBC called Tribe, and he would go and live with various indigenous peoples around the world, and he would live as one of the tribe for a month. And he now talks about egalitarian communities. And he was saying that there was a tribe that he went to stay with at the very end of his journey of working with these different indigenous peoples within this TV series, called the Penan tribe in Indonesia, and they have a completely egalitarian community. There is no hierarchy, there's no leaders, no one is allowed to get above their station, everyone stays the same. And his theory is that at one point in ancient history, humanity functioned on this level, and that at some point there's been something that has corrupted humanity and brought in this more sort of hierarchical system within it, which I guess is based in narcissism, because it's the narcissistic personality types that will get to the top of that leadership strata in the most part.
I think there's force in that argument, and I think what's shifted the balance is population.
Right.
Because it's well held that essentially human beings function at their most appropriate in a group of about 200 to 250.
Right.
Mainly, you know everybody else. It's the old, it takes a village to raise a child. Other people can look after one another's children. You can have that flat structure, the egalitarian approach that Mr. Parry has just mentioned and you've relayed. And so it worked. And there would be, of course, narcissists in that grouping. There would be. There would have to be.
Kept in check.
But exactly, they were kept in check. They weren't allowed to gain prominence because they were such of the minority that they could essentially be monitored, checked, and in some instances, where you would get that they would go lone wolf, they would leave the community and then basically die because they would be on their own and able to survive. So they didn't have that impact. But then as the population started to grow, that the ties that bound started to become eroded, and that people didn't know one another as much, which then created gaps between that existing populace, which a narcissist and a psychopath is able to exploit. So I think that because there was small population sizes dotted all around the planet that weren't interconnected, they were able to function as egalitarian societies because of the small number. But then when they started to connect up, it couldn't hold itself together any longer. And then that provided a fertile playground for my kind to start exploiting the issues that would arise, whereas they would have been dealt with in a different manner. But
that's really, really interesting, because I was trying to think, like, what's happened to humanity for this narcissism, for the narcissistic element, for it to really take hold and evolve and start growing in the way that it has. It's almost like I don't know. It's like it sort of jumps and it's growing. It's like,
I think it's the weakening of structures caused by increased population, and then the intermeshing of various. The hamlet became the village, and the villages merged to become a town, and so on and so forth. And that provided opportunity between the gaps. But I mean, in a way, that's a more evolved discussion for another time. And talking of which time, Madam Time has outstrode us.
Yes, I know. Well, that was a really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much, Sam, for your views and ideas and opinions there. And to all of you listening, do you agree with what Sam and I have been talking about? Quite a number of issues for you to address, and let me know your thoughts in the comments section about what we've been talking about. This has been Tea with Sam and HG. Thank you, Sam.
My pleasure. Thank you, HG.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye.